A group of wild Mustang horses surrounds a crying child on a deserted Wyoming road. What happens next is shocking. A 7-year-old boy lost and alone as the sun begins to set over the vast Wind River Valley. No one to help, no shelter in sight. Then from the golden haze of dusk, a herd of wild Mustangs appears circling the vulnerable child. Most would assume these powerful, full, untamed animals pose a deadly threat. But what these magnificent creatures do next will challenge everything you know about the natural world, led by a majestic black stallion with a mysterious white star on his forehead. These wild horses form a protective barrier around the frightened boy. When a reclusive Vietnam veteran witnesses this extraordinary behavior, it sets in motion a chain of events that will uncover long-buried secrets, unite a divided community, and reveal an astonishing connection between a child and the wildest creatures roaming the American West. As developers threaten both the Mustang's territory and the boy's ancestral ranch, unlikely alliances form, including a notorious motorcycle club with their own code of honor. What unfolds is a story of courage, loyalty, and the unbreakable bond between humans and animals that will leave even the most experienced wildlife rangers in disbelief. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The sun had begun to set over the vast Wyoming landscape, casting long shadows across the quiet rural road. The air was crisp, carrying the faint scent of sagebrush and pie from the nearby mountains. It should have been a peaceful evening, but for one small child, it was anything but. 7-year-old Joshua Blackwood sat on the ground near the roadside, his tiny body trembling as sobs racked his chest. His jeans were torn at the knees and his hands were scraped from where he had fallen. While running, he had wandered too far from his grandmother's ranch, chasing after a jackrabbit, and now he had no idea how to get back. His little heart pounded with fear as he called for his grandmother, but no one answered. The road stretched endlessly in both directions, and aside from the occasional rustle of tall grass, it was eerily silent. "Grandma," Joshua called again, his voice breaking. "Grandma, where are you?" Only the wind answered, whistling softly through the sagebrush. Joshua hugged his arms around his small frame, trying to stay brave, but fresh tears steamed down his dirt-smudged face. The fading light made the shadows grow longer, more threatening, and the boy's imagination turned every rustling bush into a potential danger. "Please," he whispered to no one. "In particular, I want to go home then." Suddenly there was movement. A soft rumbling sound came from beyond a nearby hill, followed by the distinct sound of hooves against the hard-packed earth. Joshua's breath hitched as he turned toward the noise, his wide, tear-filled eyes locked onto the figures emerging from the golden haze of sunset. A group of wild Mustangs stepped onto the road. Their powerful bodies moved with grace and purpose, their coats gleaming under the fading sunlight. Their eyes, sharp and alert, leading them was a magnificent black stallion with a distinctive white star on his forehead oars. Joshua whispered, fear and wonder mingling in his voice. Joshua's breath came in short gasps as the horses circled around him, forming what appeared to be a protective barrier. His small fingers dug into the dirt as he instinctively shrank back. Were they going to trample him? The black stallion took a step closer, his ears pricked forward, eyes scanning the boy carefully. Joshua let out a small whimper. Frozen in place, these weren't gentle farm horses, they were wild Mustangs, untamed and unpredictable. "Please don't hurt me," he whimpered. The stallion let out a soft snort, his breath visible in the cooling evening air. He lowered his massive head and gently nudged Joshua's shoulder with his velvety muzzle. Joshua flinched at first, but soon realized the horse wasn't attacking him. Instead, the stallion's gesture seemed almost comforting. Another Mustang, a dappled gray mare, stepped closer, sniffing the air around the child. Her tail swished gently as she too lowered her head toward him. The realization slowly dawned on Joshua. They weren't here to hurt him. They were curious, perhaps even protective. His tears slowed as he stared into the intelligent eyes of the horses around him. Do you know where my grandma is?" he asked softly, his voice barely above a whisper. Of course the horses couldn't answer, but the black stallion turned his head toward the direction from which they had come, then back to Joshua, as if gesturing for him to follow. Then, As if by some silent command, the mustangs repositioned themselves. Some stood ahead of Joshua, some behind, and the black stallion remained right beside him. It was clear now they were leading him somewhere. Joshua hesitated for a moment, but something in the way the horses moved, their calm presence, made him feel safe. With a deep breath, he wiped the last of his tears and slowly stood up. "Are you taking me home?" he asked, reaching out tentatively to touch the stallion's muscular shoulder. As soon as he did, the black stallion let out a short, sharp whinny that echoed across the valley. Then in the far distance came a reply, the sound of an engine, followed by headlights appearing over the crest of a hill. Thomas Redwater had been driving his old pickup truck back to his isolated cabin after a rare trip into town for supplies, when he spotted something unusual on the road ahead. At first he thought his tired eyes were playing tricks on him. A group of wild mustangs standing in a circle around what appeared to be a small figure. "What in the world?" he muttered, squinting through the windshield. Thomas was 72 years old with weathered skin that told stories of decades under the harsh Wyoming sun. His hands, calloused from years of hard work, gripped the steering wheel tighter as he slowed his truck. The Vietnam veteran had seen many things in his life, but nothing quite like this. As he approached, the headlights illuminated the scene more clearly. A small boy surrounded by a protective circle of wild horses. The black stallion leading the herd stood closest to the child, and Thomas immediately recognized him by the white star on his forehead. Star. Thomas whispered a name he hadn't spoken aloud in years. "It can't be." The mustangs didn't scatter at the approach of the vehicle as they normally would. Instead, they remained in formation around the boy, only shifting slightly to allow the headlights to reveal him more clearly. Thomas stopped his truck and stepped out slowly, careful not to make any sudden movements. "Hello there," he called softly to the boy. "Are you all right, son?" Joshua looked up, relief washing over his face at the sight of another human. "I got lost," he said, his voice small and shaky. "I can't find my grandma's ranch." "You're a long way from any ranch I know," Thomas said, taking a careful step forward. "What's your name, boy?" "J. Joshua," the boy replied, wiping his nose on his sleeve. "Joshua Blackwood." Thomas felt a flicker of recognition. Blackwood. Margaret Blackwood's grandson. Joshua nodded eagerly. "You know my grandma." "I know of her," Thomas replied, memories of a time long past flashing through his mind. The Blackwood Ranch bordered the eastern edge of the public lands where these mustangs roamed. Margaret Blackwood was one of the few ranchers who had always respected the wild horses, never chasing them off her property or calling for their removal. The black stallion Star watched Thomas with intelligent eyes that seemed to hold recognition. He snorted softly, pawing at the ground once before taking a step back, creating a path for Thomas to approach the boy. "These horses," Thomas said, wonder evident in his voice. "They've been watching over you." "The big black one with the star. He's been nice to me," Joshua said, looking up at the stallion with admiration. "I was really scared, but then they came and I felt better." Thomas slowly approached, extending his hand palm up toward Star in a gesture of peace. The stallion stretched his neck forward, nostrils flaring as he took in Thomas's scent. Then, to Joshua's amazement, the powerful wild horse gently pressed his muzzle against the old man's hand. "He knows you," Joshua exclaimed, his eyes wide with wonder. Thomas felt a lump in his throat. "We have history, this one and I." He turned his attention back to the boy. "Let's get you home, son. Your grandmother must be worried sick." "But what about the horses?" Joshua asked, concerned in his voice. "Will they be okay? They've survived out here for generations." Thomas assured him they know these lands better than any man, as if understanding the mustangs began to shift again, opening a clear path toward Thomas's truck. The old man offered his hand to Joshua, who took it without hesitation. "Can the horses come with us?" Joshua asked, looking back at the herd. Thomas smiled gently. "They'll follow in their own way. They've been watching over these lands for generations." As Thomas helped Joshua into the passenger seat of his truck, the boy looked back at the mustangs, particularly at Star. "Thank you," he whispered. The black stallion tossed his head as if acknowledging the boy's gratitude before turning and leading the herd away from the road and back toward the hills, but they didn't go far instead, keeping pace alongside the road as Thomas's truck began to move. "They're following us," Joshua said in awe, pressing his face against the window. Thomas nodded, his mind racing with questions. Yes, they are, and that's not normal, son, not normal. At all. Why are they doing that? Joshua asked, his eyes never leaving the magnificent animals running alongside them. I wish I knew, Thomas replied honestly. In all my years working with horses, I've never seen wild mustangs behave this way as they drove toward the Blackwood Ranch. Thomas couldn't help but wonder about the connection between this boy and the mustangs, especially Star. It defied everything he knew about wild mustang behavior. Joshua, how long were you out there before the horses came? The boy thought for a moment. I don't know. The sun was still up high when I got lost. I was looking for my jackrabbit friend. He lives in a burrow near the big rock, but I went too far. And the horses. What exactly did they do when they found you? Joshua's face brightened. Despite his ordeal, they came over the hill, lots of them. The big black one saw me first. I thought they might run me over, but they didn't. They made a circle around me like they were keeping me safe. Thomas's knuckles whitened as he gripped the steering wheel. Star had been the leader of this particular Mustang herd for years, known for his fierce protection of the other horses, but protecting a human child, that was something altogether different. Has anything like this happened before? Have you seen these horses before today? Joshua nodded enthusiastically. Sometimes they come near Grandma's fence. The black one watches me when I play. Grandma says I shouldn't go near them because they're wild, but they don't. Seems scary to me. Thomas felt a chill run down his spine. The Mustangs had been watching the boy perhaps for weeks or months. But why in the distance the lights of the Blackwood Ranch came into view? Even from here, Thomas could see the frantic activity flashlights moving across the property. The shapes of people searching. Margaret Blackwood stood by the main gate, her slight frame illuminated by the headlights of several parked vehicles. There's my grandma, Joshua exclaimed, his face lighting up with relief. Thomas slowed the truck as they approached the ranch entrance. In his rearview mirror, he caught one last glimpse of Star and his herd standing on a ridge overlooking the ranch, their silhouette stark against the darkening sky. Joshua, Thomas said quietly before they reached the gate, those horses did something special tonight, something I've never seen in all my years working with Mustangs. The boy looked up at him with innocent eyes. They're my friends. Thomas nodded slowly. Yes, I believe they are, and that Joshua Blackwood is what makes this so extraordinary. Telling and preparing this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us now. Back to the story. Margaret Blackwood held Joshua tightly against her chest, her weathered hands trembling slightly as she stroked his hair. Her eyes, tired from decades of hard work and recent worry, were now bright with tears of relief. The search party that had gathered neighbors, ranch hands, and local law enforcement stood back respectfully, allowing the grandmother and grandson their moment of reunion. Thank God you're safe, she whispered, her voice breaking with emotion. When you didn't come back for dinner, I thought she couldn't finish the sentence, the fear still too. Roar. Joshua hugged his grandmother tightly. I'm okay, Grandma, the horses took care of me. Margaret pulled back slightly, confusion crossing her lined face. Horses? What horses, sweetheart? Before Joshua could answer, Sheriff James Holden stepped forward, a tall man with salt and pepper hair and tired eyes that had seen too much in his 30 years of service. He exuded calm authority even in his concern. Mrs. Blackwood, we should get the boy checked out. Just to be safe, Dr. Mitchell is here. Margaret nodded, finally looking up to acknowledge the man who had brought her grandson home. Her eyes widened with recognition. Thomas Redwater. She said the name falling from her lips like a long-forgotten memory. It's been years. Thomas shifted, uncomfortably unused to social interaction after his decades of self-imposed isolation. His hands, calloused and strong, despite his age, fidgeted with the brim of his worn hat. Margaret, he acknowledged with a slight nod. The boy was out on Ridge Road, found him about 5 mil east. Sheriff Holden frowned, his bushy eyebrows drawing together. 5 miles. That's impossible. We had search teams in that area not an hour ago. Well, I found him there, Thomas replied, simply unwilling to elaborate further in front of the crowd. Dr. Sarah Mitchell, a woman in her 40s with kind eyes and practical hands that had delivered countless folds of CES over the years, approached Joshua. Hey there, young man, she said warmly. Mind if I take a quick look at you, make sure you're okay after your adventure? Joshua nodded, though his attention was focused on Thomas, who was already backing away toward his truck. Mr. Thomas, he called out. Are you leaving? You haven't told them about Star yet, Thomas. Froze his back stiffening at the mention of the name the gathered neighbors exchanged. Curious glances while Sheriff Holden's eyes narrowed with interest. Star. The sheriff questioned Joshua. Nodded eagerly, oblivious to Thomas's discomfort. The black horse with the white star on his head. He protected me. Mr. Thomas knows him. All eyes turned to Thomas, who looked as though he'd rather be anywhere else. Margaret, sensing his discomfort, gently guided Joshua toward the house. Let's get you inside, sweetheart. Dr. Mitchell needs to check you over, and then you can tell us all about these horses. As the crowd began to disperse, Sheriff Holden approached Thomas, his expression unreadable, mind sticking around a bit longer. Redwater, I'd like to hear more about how you found the boy. It wasn't really a request. Thomas nodded reluctantly, knowing that his first interaction with the town in years was about to become more complicated than he'd anticipated. Inside the modest ranch house, Joshua sat at the kitchen table, a glass of milk and a plate of cookies in front of him. Dr. Mitchell had confirmed he was fine aside from minor scrapes and mild dehydration. Margaret hovered nearby, unwilling to let her grandson out of her sight. Just yet, Sheriff Holden and Thomas entered an uncomfortable silence between them. Joshua's face lit up at the sight of Thomas. Mr. Thomas, did you tell Sheriff Holden about Star and the other horses? Thomas glanced at Margaret apologetically before taking a seat at the table. Not yet, son. Sheriff Holden pulled out his notepad. Why don't you tell me? What happened? Joshua, from the beginning. Joshua launched into his story with childish enthusiasm, describing how he'd followed a jackrabbit too far from the ranch, gotten lost, and eventually sat down to cry on the roadside, and then the horses came. He exclaimed, his hands gesturing wildly. A whole bunch of them. The big black one with the star on his head stood right next to me. They made a circle around me like they were keeping me safe. The adults exchanged glances, attributing the fantastic elements to a child's imagination, all except Thomas, who stared into his coffee, his weathered face giving nothing away. That's quite a story, Sheriff Holden said gently. But wild horses don't typically approach humans. Let loons surround them protectively. They did, Joshua insisted. Tell him, Mr. Thomas, you saw them all. Eyes turned to Thomas, who hesitated before speaking. I found the boy surrounded by the Mustang herd from Red Rock Mesa. He said finally they had formed a protective circle around him. The black stallion, the one with the star, was standing beside him. Sheriff Holden looked incredulous. You're saying wild Mustangs were protecting a human child? I know what I saw. Thomas interrupted firmly. I've worked with horses all my life, Sheriff. What I witnessed tonight isn't normal behavior for wild Mustangs, but it happened. The sheriff stared at him for a long moment, trying to determine if the reclusive old man was lying, or perhaps not entirely sound of mind. And you say, you know this particular stallion. Thomas's jaw tightened. I said the boy called him Star, that's all, but Joshua wasn't having it. Mr. Thomas called him Star too. He said they have history. Margaret looked sharply at Thomas. Questions in her eyes. There was something. He wasn't telling them. Sheriff Holden wrote something in his notepad. Mr. Redwater, I'd like you to come down to the station tomorrow. Give a formal statement. Thomas nodded curtly, already regretting his involvement. Sheriff Margaret interjected. It's been a long night. Can't this wait? Sheriff Holden's expression softened slightly as he looked at the older woman. They had history too, having both lived in Pinecrest their entire lives. Just procedure, Margaret. Nothing to worry about if everything's as straightforward as it seems. But there was nothing straightforward about wild Mustangs protecting a human child, and everyone in the room knew it. After the sheriff left, an awkward silence fell over the kitchen. Joshua, oblivious to the tension, continued eating his cookies finally. Margaret spoke. Joshua, why don't you go get ready for your bath? I need to talk to Mr. Redwater for a minute. Joshua looked disappointed but didn't argue. Okay, Grandma, but can Mr. Thomas come back tomorrow? I want to ask him more about the horses. Margaret gave him a small smile. We'll see now. Go on. Once Joshua had left the room, Margaret turned to Thomas, her expression serious. What really happened out there, Thomas? Thomas sighed, suddenly looking everyone. Of his 72 years, exactly what I said. I found your grandson surrounded by the wild Mustang herd. They were protecting him. Margaret, I've never seen anything like it. Margaret studied him carefully. And the black stallion Joshua said you knew him, Thomas's. Gaze drifted to the window where the night had fully settled over the valley. It was a long time ago. Thomas Redwater. I've known you since we were children. You've never been much for talking. But I know when you're holding something back, Thomas. Met her gaze finally, the black stallion. I helped him once years ago when he was just a foe. His mother had been killed in a Bureau of Land Management roundup. He was wounded, left behind, and you saved him. Margaret finished, understanding dawning on her face. Thomas nodded. Nursed him back to health at my cabin. When he was strong enough, I released him. Back to the wild, never expected to see him again, yet he recognized you tonight, appears so. Margaret took a seat across from him. Her hands clasped tightly in front of her. Why would he protect Joshua? Thomas shook his head. I don't know, it doesn't make sense. Wild mustangs don't form bonds with humans. The way domestic horses do, they survivors, they avoid people. Yet they surrounded my grandson, protected him. Thomas had no answer for that. The silence stretched between them, filled with unanswered questions. There's something else you should know, Margaret said finally, her voice lower. This isn't the first time Joshua has mentioned the mustangs. He talks about them watching him from the ridge above our east pasture. I thought it was just a child's imagination, but now you're not so sure. Thomas finished for her. Margaret nodded. He says, the black one star comes closest. Sometimes stands at the fence line watching him play. Thomas frowned. This was getting stranger by the minute. Wild mustangs, particularly herd stallions, didn't make a habit of watching human children. They certainly didn't approach ranch boundaries voluntarily. Has he ever gone near them, tried to feed them? Margaret shook her head. I've told him repeatedly to stay away from the fence when they're near. Wild horses are unpredictable, dangerous, yet they protected him today. Thomas mused. Yes, Margaret agreed. They did. The sound of running water from the bathroom upstairs broke the moment. Margaret's sigh, pushing herself to her feet. I should go help him. He's still too young to run his own bath properly. Thomas stood as well, ready to make his escape. I should head back to my place. Sheriff Holden expects you at the station tomorrow, Margaret reminded him. Thomas grimaced. I'll be there. As he turned to leave, Margaret placed a hand on his arm. Thank you, Thomas, for finding him, for bringing him home. The simple touch, the genuine gratitude in her voice made Thomas uncomfortable. He'd spent too many years alone, away from human connection. He nodded awkwardly and headed for the door outside. The night air was cool and crisp, carrying the familiar sense of sage and pine. Thomas paused on the porch, his eyes scanning the darkened landscape in the distance barely visible in the moonlight. He could make out the silhouettes of horses on the ridge overlooking the ranch. They were still there watching. The black stallion stood apart from the others, his powerful form unmistakable even in the darkness. As Thomas watched, the horse raised his head, seeming to look directly at him across the distance. Then with a toss of his head, Star turned and disappeared over the ridge. The rest of the herd following Thomas felt a chill that had nothing to do with the night air. Something strange was happening in Wind River Valley, something he couldn't explain. And despite his best efforts to remain uninvolved, he was now right in the middle of it. The drive back to his isolated cabin was quiet. The truck's headlights cutting through the darkness of the rural road. Thomas's mind was filled with questions. Why had Star and his herd protected Joshua? Why were they watching the boy? And perhaps most troubling, what would happen next as he pulled up to his small weathered cabin tucked against the base of a wooded hillside? Thomas couldn't shake the feeling that his carefully constructed solitude was about to be shattered after decades of avoiding the complications of human interaction, of living. With only his memories and regrets for company, he was being drawn back into the world, and it had all started with a boy and a herd of wild mustache. Music inside his sparse cabin. Thomas lit a kerosene lamp and settled into his worn armchair. On the rue-hewn table beside him sat an old photograph in a simple wooden frame, the only personal item visible in the entire room. In it, a much younger Thomas stood beside a magnificent black horse, not Star but another from long ago, a military service horse. Both man and animal wore the unmistakable markers of war. Uniformed, disciplined, prepared for duty. Thomas picked up the frame, his fingers tracing the outline of the horse. "What do you make of all this, old friend?" he murmured to the empty room only. Silence answered him, but as the night deepened around his isolated cabin, Thomas knew that tomorrow would bring challenges he hadn't faced in years. People asking questions, expectations, involvement, and somewhere out in the darkness, a herd of wild mustangs led by a stallion he had once saved was doing something unprecedented, forming a connection with a human child. It defied everything Thomas knew about wild horses, about the natural order of things. Yet he had seen it with his own eyes. Thomas set the photograph down and moved to the window, staring out. At the moonlit landscape in the morning, he would have to go into town. Face the sheriff, answer questions, but for now he stood in silence, watching the night, wondering what dawn would bring. The Pinehurst Sheriff Station was a modest brick building on Main Street, its entrance flanked by wooden benches where old-timers often gathered to exchange gossip and watch the slow rhythm of small-town life unfold this morning. Those benches were occupied by 3 elderly men, who fell silent as Thomas Redwater approached, his weathered boots scuffing against the sidewalk. It had been years since most people in town had seen the reclusive Vietnam veteran, and his appearance caused a ripple of whispered conversation. Thomas ignored them, squaring his shoulders as he pushed open the glass door and stepped inside. The reception area smelled of coffee and paper, its walls adorned with community notices and faded photographs of Pinecrest's law enforcement through the decades deputy. A young man with an eager expression looked up from his desk with surprise. "Mr. Redwater, Sheriff Holden is expecting you. Go right in." Thomas nodded without speaking and made his way to the sheriff's office. Through the open door he could see Holden wasn't alone. A well-dressed man in his 50s with silver-streaked dark hair and a tailored suit that marked him as an outsider in this rural community sat across from the sheriff. Thomas, Sheriff Holden said, rising from his chair. "Come in, this is Victor Harrington. He's acquired some property in the valley and heard about our excitement last night." Victor Harrington stood, extending a manicured hand that contrasted sharply with Thomas's calloused palm. "Mr. Redwater, pleasure to meet you. I've heard a lot about you." "Can't imagine why," Thomas replied, his voice gruff as he withdrew his hand quickly. Harrington smiled, though it didn't reach his eyes. "Small towns. Everyone has a story." He turned to Sheriff Holden. "I won't take up any more of your time. We can continue our discussion about the development permits later." As Harrington brushed past Thomas, he paused. "By the way, I heard you found the Blackwood boy with a herd of wild mustangs. Fascinating story. I'd love to hear more about it." Sometime Thomas remained silent, his expression impassive until Harrington had left. Only then did he turn to Sheriff Holden with a questioning look. "Victor Harrington," the sheriff explained, gesturing for Thomas to take a seat. "Businessman from Denver, been buying up land around here for the past year, has plans for some kind of resort in Wind River Valley." Thomas couldn't keep the disbelief from his voice. Sheriff Holden shrugged. "Tourism dollars, jobs. That's what the town council keeps saying. Personally, I have my reservations, but it's not my call." He pulled out his notepad. "Now about last night, I need your formal statement about finding Joshua Blackwood." Thomas recounted the event, simply leaving out nothing, but offering no elaboration beyond the facts when he described the Mustang's behavior. Sheriff Holden's pen paused on the paper. "Be certain they were forming a protective circle. Not just curious about the boy. I know horses," Thomas replied flatly. "Who? Been training them since before you were born, Sheriff. What those Mustangs were doing wasn't natural. They were protecting him." Sheriff Holden set his pen down. "And the black stallion, the one Joshua calls Star, you say you recognized him?" Thomas hesitated. "I helped a black foe once years back after a BLM roundup went bad. Could be the same animal. That's quite a coincidence. Life's full of them." The sheriff leaned back in his chair, studying Thomas carefully. "Frank Miller from the Bureau of Land Management called this morning, said that herds scheduled for roundup next month. Apparently they're expanding the cattle grazing leases in that area." Thomas's jaw tightened. "Those Mustangs have roamed those hills for generations." "It's not my jurisdiction, Sheriff," Holden said, though his tone suggested he wasn't entirely comfortable with the situation. "But given what happened with Joshua, I thought you might want to know." Thomas rose from his chair. "We done here?" The sheriff nodded for now, but Thomas. "Word travels fast in small towns. People are already talking about the boy and the Mustangs. Don't be surprised if you get folks coming around asking questions. Let them talk. Thomas muttered as he turned to leave. Doesn't change anything. But as Thomas stepped out onto the sidewalk, he knew that wasn't true. Something had changed. The careful isolation he had maintained for decades was already crumbling around him across the street. Murphy's diner was doing brisk business, the morning crowd visible through its large windows. Thomas was about to head for his truck when the diner door opened and Margaret Blackwood emerged, Joshua at her side. The boy spotted him immediately. "Mr. Thomas," Joshua called out, breaking free from his grandmother's hand and dashing across the empty street. "We were having breakfast. Did you talk to Sheriff Holden about Star?" Thomas looked helplessly at Margaret, who approached at a more dignified pace. She looked tired, the lines around her eyes deeper in the morning light. "Joshua, give Mr. Redwater some space," she chided gently. "It's all right," Thomas said, surprising himself. "How are you feeling today, son?" Joshua bounced on his toes, seemingly fully recovered from his ordeal. "I'm good, Grandma. Let me have chocolate chip pancakes. Have you seen Star today? Do you think he's okay?" "I imagine he's just fine," Thomas replied. "Wild mustangs know how to take care of themselves." Margaret placed a protective hand on Joshua's shoulder. "We were just heading to the bank, some business to take care of." Something in her tone caught Thomas's attention. The tightness around her mouth, the worry in her eyes that had nothing to do with Joshua's adventure yesterday. "Everything all right?" he asked quietly. Margaret gave Joshua a gentle push. "Go, look at the toys in the window of Hanson's store for a minute. Honey, stay where I can see you once." Joshua was out of earshot. Margaret's composure slipped slightly. "The bank's threatening foreclosure on the ranch. I'm 3 months behind on the mortgage, been trying to negotiate an extension." But she straightened her shoulders. "We'll manage, we always do." Thomas frowned. The Blackwood Ranch had been in Margaret's family for 4 generations. "I didn't realize things were that tight. Ranching isn't what it used to be," she said simply. "Costs go up, beef prices stay the same. And since David and Karen died." She trailed off, glancing at Joshua. "He's all I have left. I can't lose the ranch too. It's his inheritance." Before Thomas could respond, a loud rumble filled the street as 3 motorcycles pulled up in front of the diner. The riders were clad in leather jackets emblazoned with a distinctive logo. A skeletal cowboy astride a flaming horse, the Frontier. Outlaws, the small motorcycle club, had a reputation that extended well beyond Pinecrest boundaries. Margaret instinctively moved toward Joshua, but the bikers paid them no mind, dismounting and heading into the diner. Thomas watched them go, his expression unreadable. "They've been around more lately," Margaret commented. "Ever since Harrington started buying up land." Thomas raised an eyebrow. "Harrington, the man in the sheriff's office?" Margaret nodded. "Victor Arrington. He's been approaching all the ranchers, offering to buy them out. Some have taken his money and moved on others." She shook her head. "He offered to buy the Blackwood place. Last month I turned him down flat, and now the bank's threatening foreclosure," Thomas said quietly. Margaret's eyes flashed. "I'm not saying there's a connection, but it's convenient timing for him." Joshua came running back, his attention caught by the motorcycles. "Whoa, cool bikes, come on." "Joshua," Margaret said, taking his hand, "we need to get to the bank." "Wait," Thomas said impulsively. "Will you be at the ranch this afternoon? I'd like to stop by. Talk about the Mustangs." Margaret looked surprised, but nodded. "We should be home by 2." As Thomas watched them walk away, Joshua chattering excitedly about the motorcycles, he found himself torn between the urge to retreat back to his cabin and the nagging feeling that something bigger was unfolding in Wind River Valley, something that involved wild mustangs, a 7-year-old boy, and perhaps even a slick businessman from Denver. Against his better judgment, he turned toward the diner rather than his truck. Murphy's diner hadn't changed much in the decades since Thomas had last set foot inside. The same red vinyl booths lined the windows. The same Formica counters stretched along the back wall. The only difference was Murphy himself, now gray-haired and heavy-set, but with the same quick smile. "Well, I'll be damned," Murphy said as Thomas approached the counter. "Thomas Redwater, back from the dead, not dead," Thomas corrected, sliding onto a stool. "Just keeping to myself for 20-some years. Murphy pointed out, pouring coffee without being asked. "Must have been quite a sight to bring you back to town." Thomas glanced toward the corner booth where the frontier outlaws sat, their leather jackets creaking as they leaned over their plates of food, heard some talk about a BLM roundup planned for the Mustang herd at Red Rock Mesa. Murphy nodded, lowering his voice. Voice next month. Frank Miller was in here yesterday talking about. It said they're clearing the land for more cattle grazing. Those horses have been there since before any of us were born. Times change, Murphy said with a shrug. Besides, word is Harrington's got plans for that area big resort project. Can't have wild horses running through the golf course, can you? Thomas's hand tightened around his coffee mug. Golf course, that's the rumor. A wilderness retreat for rich folks from the cities. Spa golf course, hunting excursions. The works from the corner booth. One of the bikers looked up, his bearded face turning toward Thomas with interest. After a moment he nudged his companions and stood making his way to the counter. You're Redwater, the man said. It wasn't a question. The horse trainer. Cavalry in N. Thomas eyed him wearily. That was a long time ago. The biker extended a tattooed hand. Jack. Reserved in Afghanistan, different war. Same. His grip was firm, his eyes assessing Thomas with military precision. Heard you found a kid with the wild Mustangs last night. News travels fast, Thomas commented dry. Jack jerked his head toward his companions. My brother's kid works at the sheriff's office, Deputy Larson. He mentioned it. He lowered his voice, also mentioned the BLM's plans for those horses. Thomas said nothing, waiting. See, we got an interest in those Mustangs. Jack continued, been watching that herd for years. Something special about them. Wild, free, the way this country used to be. Didn't figure the frontier, outlaws for horse lovers, Thomas remarked. Jack's weathered face broke into a grin. We contain multitudes, old man. He grew serious again. Harrington's got the town council in his pocket, got the bank leaning on D folks like Margaret Blackwood. Now he's got the BLM doing his dirty work clearing those Mustangs so he can build his playground for rich, and you care. Because Jack shrugged. Maybe we just don't like seeing the little guy get pushed around, or maybe we've got our own reasons for wanting to keep Wind River Valley the way it is. He straightened up. Either way, those horses deserve better than a one-way trip to some slaughterous in Mexico. Thomas took a sip of his coffee, considering the biker's words. I'm not looking to get involved in other people's problems. Bit late for that, Jack commented. The moment you found that boy surrounded by those Mustangs, you got involved. He pulled a worn business card from his pocket and slid it across the counter. You change your mind about getting involved, give me a call. As Jack returned to his booth, Thomas pocketed the card automatically. His mind was racing with the implications of what he'd learned. The BLM roundup, Harrington's development plans, the bank's pressure on Margaret's ranch. It all seemed to be connected, and somehow at the center of it all were a boy and a herd of wild Mustangs behaving in ways Thomas couldn't explain. After finishing his coffee, Thomas paid and headed for his truck. He had planned to go straight back to his cabin to retreat to the solitude that had been his refuge for so many years. Instead, he found himself driving toward the Blackwood Ranch. The road took him past the eastern boundary of Red Rock Mesa, where the wild Mustangs often grazed. Thomas slowed his truck, scanning the landscape for signs of the herd. At first he saw nothing but the rolling grasslands and scattered junipers that characterize this part of Wyoming. Then, as he rounded a bend, he spotted them. The Mustang herd grazing peacefully on a distant hillside. Even from this distance he could make out the black stallion standing slightly apart from the others, his head raised as if watching Thomas's approach. Thomas pulled over and cut the engine. For a long moment he simply sat there studying the horses through his windshield, then, driven by an impulse he couldn't quite explain, he stepped out of the truck. Star watched him, ears pricked forward, completely alert. When Thomas took a step away from the road, the stallion snorted and poured the ground once, twice. Then, to Thomas's astonishment, he broke away from the herd and began trotting directly toward him. Well, I'll be damned, Thomas murmured as Star approached, stopping about 30 yards away. Thomas was struck by how much the Mustang had grown and matured since he had last held him as a wounded foe. The gangly legs had developed into powerful limbs, the fuzzy F-coat replaced by a gleaming black hide. The uncertain movements transformed into the confident stance of a herd leader, and yet there was recognition in those dark eyes. Memory connection. Hello, old friend, Thomas said softly. You've done well for yourself. Star tossed his head, his long mane catching the sunlight, then turned abruptly and galloped back to his herd. As Thomas watched him go, He felt a certainty settling into his bones. He was indeed involved now, whether he liked it or not. And the stakes were higher than he had imagined. The Blackwood ranch house came into view as Thomas crested the hill, its weathered wooden siding and wraparound porch a testament to generations of family history. A faded sign bearing the Blackwood, a brand, a stylized B with a flowing river beneath it, hung above the entrance to the main barn. Several horses grazed in the nearest, pasture domestic quarter horses that bore little resemblance to the wild mustangs Thomas had seen earlier. As he pulled up to the house, Thomas noticed a dark sedan parked in the drive, sleek and expensive, completely out of place in these rural surroundings. The front door of the house opened before he could shut off his engine, and Joshua came bounding down the porch steps. "Mr. Thomas, you came." The boy's face was alight with excitement until he glanced back at the house, his expression suddenly uncertain. Thomas stepped out of his truck, immediately sensing tension in the air. Margaret appeared in the doorway. Her posture stiff and unwelcoming. Behind her stood Victor Harrington, his tailored suit jacket draped over one arm, a calculated smile on his face. "Mr. Redwater," Harrington called out pleasantly. "What a surprise. We were just discussing the Blackwood property." Thomas nodded curtly, directing his attention to Margaret. "Bad timing. I can come back." "No," Margaret said firmly. Mr. Harrington was just leaving. Her tone made it clear this wasn't a polite suggestion. Harrington's smile didn't waver as he slipped his jacket on. "Think about my offer, Margaret. It's more than fair, especially considering your financial situation." He nodded to Thomas as he descended the steps. "Always a pleasure." Thomas watched in silence as Harrington slid into his expensive sedan and drove away, dust billowing behind his tires on the dry ranch road. "I don't like him," Joshua declared, kicking at a pebble with the toe of his boot. "He wants to take our ranch." Margaret sighed, running a hand through her silver reed hair. "Joshua, go check on Penny. I think she's about ready to fall." The boy hesitated, clearly wanting to stay and hear the adult conversation, but eventually nodded and headed toward the horse barn. "Penny's nowhere near foeing," Thomas observed once Joshua was out of earshot. A hint of a smile crossed Margaret's tired face. "He doesn't know that." She gestured toward the porch, where two rocking chairs filled the valley. Thomas followed her, settling awkwardly into one of the chairs. As Margaret lowered herself into the other, Harrington's raised his offer. She said without preamble, "Almost double what the ranch is worth on paper, but not what it's worth to you." Thomas guessed Margaret's weathered hands gripped the arms of her rocker. "This land has been in my new family since 1889. My great-grandfather built this house with timber. He hauled down from the mountains himself." She gazed out at the rolling pastures. "Joshua was born in the upstairs bedroom. So was his father. Some things you can't put a price on, but the bank can," Thomas said quietly. Margaret nodded, her jaw tight. 60 days, that's what they're giving me to get current on the mortgage, before they start foreclosure proceedings." She turned to face him directly. "Harrington knew the exact amount I owe, right down to the penny. Inside information has to be. Bank managers' ethics seem to have a price tag." She leaned back in her chair, suddenly looking all of her 68 years. "I've been running the numbers every which way. Even if I sell half my breeding stock, it won't be enough." Thomas wasn't sure why she was sharing this with him. They had been neighbors of sorts for decades, but hardly friends. His self-imposed isolation had seen to that. "I'm sorry," he offered. Inadequately, Margaret surprised him with a short laugh. "I didn't tell you this for sympathy, Thomas. I told you because I think it connects to what happened with Joshua and those Mustangs." Her expression grew serious. "The timing's too neat. Harrington wants this land, the bank suddenly gets aggressive about the mortgage, and then my grandson gets lost and is found with a herd of wild horses that are scheduled to be rounded up next month." Thomas frowned. "You think it's all connected. I don't believe in coincidences, not in Wind River Valley." Margaret fixed him with a penetrating gaze, the way Joshua tells it. "Those Mustangs protected him like they knew who he was, like they were sending a message." Thomas shifted uncomfortably. He'd spent too many years avoiding the mystical talk that sometimes circulated among old-timers in the valley. Stories of special connections between the land, the animals, and the people who had lived here for generations. "Horses don't send messages. Margaret, don't they?" She raised an eyebrow. You're the horse expert. You tell me why a wild stallion you saved years ago would form a protective circle around my grandson before Thomas could respond. The sound of hooves on hard-packed earth drew their attention. Joshua was running toward them from the direction of the east pasture, his small legs pumping furiously. "Grandma, Mr. Thomas. They're here. The Mustangs are at the fence." Margaret rose, quickly concern etched on her face. "Joshua, I told you to check on Penny, but I saw them from the barn window. Star is there too." The boy was practically vibrating with excitement. Thomas stood, something in the boy's urgency catching his attention, where exactly the east fence by the old oak. Joshua was already turning, ready to run back. "Come on." Thomas exchanged a glance with Margaret before they both followed the boy across the ranch yard and toward the eastern boundary of the property. The Blackwood Ranch bordered public land on this side, rolling hills that eventually gave way to the rockier terrain of Red Rock Mesa. As they crested a small rise, Thomas saw them, the Mustang herd, standing just beyond the barbed wire fence that marked the property line. Star stood at the front, his head, high ears pricked forward, watching their approach. "See," Joshua exclaimed, slowing to a walk as they neared the fence. "I told you." Thomas counted at least 20 horses, mares, yearlings, and a few young stallions, kept in check by Star's dominant presence. It was unusual to see the herd this close to human habitation, particularly in the middle of the day. "They shouldn't be here," Thomas muttered, more to himself than to the others. Joshua approached the fence slowly, his earlier excitement tempered by caution. "Star," he called softly, hello, to Thomas's amazement. The black stallion took a step closer, nostrils flaring as he took in the boy's scent across the barrier of the fence. The other Mustangs remained perfectly still. Watching Joshua, Margaret warned, "Stay back from the fence. Wild horses are unpredictable." But Joshua seemed unafraid, reaching a small hand toward the fence post. "Not quite crossing the boundary between domestic and wild, but close. He won't hurt me, Grandma. He protected me, remember?" Star snorted, pouring at the ground with one powerful hoof. Then, as if making a decision, he tossed his head and whistled, a piercing sound that carried across the valley. The response was immediate. From the direction of Red Rock Mesa came answering calls, and within minutes more Mustangs appeared on the horizon. "My God," Margaret breathed, "the whole herd must be here indeed." As the newcomers joined the horses already at the fence, Thomas estimated there were now close to 50 Mustangs gathered, nearly the entire population that roamed this part of Wyoming. Their behavior defied everything he knew about wild horse patterns. They should be scattered across the mesa grazing in smaller family groups. Instead, they were gathered here at the boundary of the Blackwood Ranch, as if they're showing themselves. Thomas said quietly, the realization hitting him suddenly, making themselves known. "But why?" Margaret asked, moving closer to Joshua protectively. Thomas had no answer, but the boy looked up at him with perfect confidence. "They're saying hello. They're my friends." Star whistled again, rearing slightly before settling back, on all fours, his dark eyes fixed on Joshua. The display wasn't threatening. If anything, it was performative, as if the stallion was demonstrating his strength and vitality. "Grandma, can I go closer?" Joshua asked. "Absolutely not," Margaret replied. "Lie, fence or no fence, these are wild animals." Joshua looked disappointed but didn't argue. Instead, he raised his hand in a small wave. "Bye, Star. Thank you for helping me," to the adult's astonishment. The black stallion dipped his head almost like a nod before turning away from the fence with another whistle. He led the herd back toward the mesa, their movements fluid and coordinated like a single organism flowing across the landscape. As the Mustangs disappeared over a distant rise, the three humans stood in silence, trying to process what they had witnessed. That wasn't normal. Margaret finally said no. Thomas agreed it wasn't. Joshua turned to look up at them, his young face solemn. "They came to say goodbye. They're going away." Something in the boy's tone sent a chill down Thomas's spine. "What do you mean, Joshua? How do you know that?" The boy shrugged, the gesture surprisingly adult on his small frame. "I just know they're going to have to leave soon. The men are coming to take them away." Margaret exchanged an alarmed look with Thomas. "Joshua, did someone tell you about the BLM roundup?" Joshua shook his head. "No. Star told me." "Star told you?" Thomas repeated slowly, not with words. Joshua clarified, as if explaining something obvious. "But I could feel it when I was lost and they found me. They're scared. They know something bad is coming." Margaret placed a hand on her grandson's shoulder. Joshua, honey, horses can't tell people things like that. The boy looked up at her. His expression, earnest, but they can. Grandma, you just have to listen, right? He turned to Thomas. You understand, don't you? Mr. Thomas, you talk to horses too. Thomas felt Margaret's questioning gaze on him, but kept his focus on Joshua. There was something about the boy's certainty that resonated with him. Memories of moments in his own childhood when he seemed to know what a horse was thinking. Feeling before anyone else did it. Wasn't mystical. He had always told himself just observation, attention to the subtle cues animals gave, but this was different. Joshua hadn't been raised around and horses the way Thomas had been, and wild mustangs didn't behave the way Star and his herd were behaving. There was something else at work here, something Thomas couldn't explain, I think. Thomas said carefully, that you're very observant, Joshua. You notice things about animals that other people. Miss Joshua considered this, then nodded, apparently satisfied with the explanation. Will you help them, Mr. Thomas? The mustangs, they need someone to help them. The simple question carried the weight of obligation. Thomas glanced at Margaret, saw the worry in her eyes. Not just for the wild horses, but for her grandson. For her ranch, for the uncertain future they faced. I'm not sure what I can do, Thomas answered honestly, but you'll try, Joshua pressed before Thomas could respond. The distant sound of an engine caught their attention. A pickup truck was approaching. Down the ranch road, dust billowing behind it. That's Frank Miller's truck, Margaret said, recognizing the Bureau of Land Management logo on the door. What's he doing here? The three of them walked back toward the ranch house, arriving just as Miller parked beside Thomas's truck. The BLM officer was a stocky man in his 40s, with a neatly trimmed beard and the sunburned complexion of someone who spent most of his time outdoors. Margaret he greeted, tipping his hat. He nodded to Thomas, surprise crossing his features. Redwater didn't expect to see you here. His gaze settled on Joshua, and this must be the boy everyone's talking about, the one who made friends with the wild mustangs. Joshua stared at Miller wearily, edging closer to his grandmother. What brings you by? Frank, Margaret asked, her tone civil but cool. Miller pulled a folded document from his jacket pocket, just dropping off the official notice. The Mustang gather is scheduled for 3 weeks from now. Since your property borders the public lands where they range, we're required to notify you, Margaret. Took the paper but didn't unfold it. Seems like an awful lot of trouble to deliver this in person. Could have mailed it. Miller shrugged, his eyes drifting to the eastern pasture. Heard the herd's been hanging close to your property lately. Unusual behavior. Thought I'd check it out while I was here. They're fine where they are, Thomas said, speaking for the first time. No need to concern yourself, Miller assessed Thomas thoughtfully. Sheriff Holden mentioned you had some history with that black stallion. The one they call Star. Ancient history, Thomas replied curtly. Even so, Miller glanced once down at Joshua, then back at the adults. That herd's getting too large for the available grazing land. The gather's necessary for their own good and for the ranchers who lease the grazing rights, and it has nothing to do with Victor Harrington's development plans. Margaret asked pointedly. A flicker of discomfort crossed Miller's face before he regained his professional demeanor. I don't know anything about that. I just implement the policies set by the Department of the Interior. Convenient, Thomas commented. Miller's expression hardened. 3 weeks, he said, gesturing to the notice in Margaret's hand. If you've got concerns about the gather, there's a public comment period. Details are in the document. He tipped his hat again. Good day to you all. As Miller drove away, Joshua looked up at the adults, his young face troubled. He's one of the men coming to take the horses away, isn't he? Margaret nodded, putting an arm around her grandson's shoulders. Yes, honey, he is. We can't let them, Joshua said firmly. Star and his family belong here. Thomas and Margaret exchanged a glance over the boy's head, a silent acknowledgement of the complex reality. They faced a 7-year-old's determination. Was no match for government bureaucracy, corporate development plans, and financial pressure. Or was it? As Thomas looked at Joshua's resolute expression, he was reminded of something his own grandfather had told him long ago. Never underestimate the power of a pure heart. It sees truths that the rest of us have forgotten how to see. Perhaps there was something to the boy's connection with the Mustangs after all. Something that might just change. Everything word about the Mustangs' unusual behavior spread through Pine Crest like wildfire. By the following evening, the story had evolved from a simple rescue to an almost mythical tale of wild horses forming a protective circle around a lost child. Inside the Pine Crest Community Center, the monthly town council meeting had drawn a crowd 3 times its normal size. Thomas slouched against the back wall, arms crossed, wondering why he'd let Margaret convince him to attend. He hadn't set foot in a town meeting in over 2 decades, and the curious glances directed his way reminded him why he preferred his Solitude Mayor Elena Thompson, a non-nonsense woman in her 60s, with a lifetime of local politics behind her, called the meeting to order with 3 sharp raps of her gavel. Before we address the regular agenda, she announced, we'll hear public comments regarding the Bureau of Land Management's planned Mustang gather. As this affects our community, we've invited Frank Miller from the BLM to address your concerns. Miller approached the podium looking uncomfortable as he faced the crowd. The gather, scheduled for 3 weeks from now, is standard procedure. The herd has grown beyond the carrying capacity of their range, and we need to maintain a balance between the Mustangs, wildlife, and livestock that share these public lands. What happens to the horses after they're rounded up? Someone called out. Miller cleared his throat. They'll be transported to holding facilities where they can be adopted. Those deemed unadoptable will remain in long-term holding pastures. A murmur rippled through the audience. Everyone knew unadoptable often meant older horses that would spend their remaining years in crowded government corrals if they were lucky. This is about Harrington's resort, isn't it? The question came from Jack Reeves, who stood at the back of the room with several other members of the frontier. Outlaws can't have wild horses running through the golf course. Miller's jaw tightened. The gather was planned before any development proposals were submitted. Then why? The rush. Margaret spoke up from her seat near the front. Joshua beside her. That herd has roamed Red Rock Mesa for generations without causing problems. Mrs. Blackwood. Mayor Thompson interjected. While we appreciate your family's long history in this valley, the BLM has jurisdiction over public lands, and we all know you're firmly in Harrington's pocket. Jack retorted, earning a few supportive murmurs and several disapproving glares. The mayor bristled. This meeting will remain civil, or you'll be asked to leave. Mr. Reeves. Victor Harrington rose from his seat in the front row, adjusting his tie before addressing the room. If I may offer some perspective. The mayor nodded, and Harrington turned to face the crowd with practiced charm. The Mountain Vista Resort project represents a tremendous opportunity for Pine Crest jobs, tourism dollars, infrastructure improvements. Yes, my plans include land currently shared with the Mustang herd, but I've already committed to funding a private sanctuary for some of the horses as part of the development. Some, Thomas repeated loudly from the back. All heads turned in his direction. Not all. Not the herd, as it exists now, living free as they're meant to. Harrington's smile didn't waver. Mr. Redwater, isn't it? I understand you have a personal attachment to these horses, but surely you recognize the economic reality. This valley needs sustainable industry, not just sentiment. Those horses are part of Wyoming's heritage. Thomas, counted once they're gone for good. Heritage doesn't pay the bills, Mayor Thompson remarked. Many of our ranching families are struggling to survive, and how many of those struggling ranchers have been approached by Mr. Harrington with offers to buy their land? Thomas asked pointedly. An uncomfortable silence fell over the room. Several ranches shifted in their seats, avoiding eye contact. The mayor cleared her throat. Let's stay focused. Fed on the BLM gather. Does anyone have specific questions for Mr. Miller? Joshua raised his hand after a moment's hesitation. The mayor acknowledged him. What if the horses don't want to go? The boy asked simply. Miller blinked, caught off guard by the question. Well, they don't really get a choice, son. We use helicopters. Toward them or toward the holding pen's helicopters. Joshua's eyes widened. That would scare them. It's standard procedure, Miller repeated, increasingly uncomfortable. Star won't let you take them, Joshua said with absolute certainty. He'll fight Star, Harrington inquired, leaning forward with sudden interest. The black stallion with the white star on his forehead, Margaret explained. He leads the herd. Harrington's eyes narrowed slightly. The same stallion that supposedly protected your grandson. Not supposedly, Thomas interjected. I saw it with my own eyes. The meeting dissolved into heated crosstalk, with factions quickly forming. Ranchers who depended on grazing leases sided with the BLM business owners excited about the resort's potential, supported Harrington, a smaller but vocal group including the Frontier Outlaws, and several longtime residents argued for protecting the Mustangs. Thomas caught Joshua's eye across the crowded room. The boy looked overwhelmed by the adult conflict. Swirling around him with a slight gesture of his head, Thomas indicated the exit and Joshua nodded, tugging on his grandmother's sleeve outside in the cool evening air. Joshua exhaled heavily. They're all so angry. Thomas nodded, leaning against the building's brick wall. Adults usually are when money's involved. Margaret joined them, shaking her head in frustration. That was pointless. The decision's already been made. Maybe Thomas conceded. Maybe not. The door opened again, and Jack Reeves emerged. With two other members of the Frontier Outlaws, the bearded biker nodded respectfully to Thomas Redwater. Mrs. Blackwood, his gaze softened as it fell on Joshua. You must be the boy who made friends with the Mustangs. Joshua nodded, studying the tattooed man with curiosity rather than fear. The meeting's a waste of time, Jack said, lighting a cigarette. Harrington's already greased all the right palms. Miller's just going through the motions, so what do we do? Margaret asked, desperation edging into her voice. I have less than 60 days before the bank forecloses, and Joshua's convinced the Mustangs are in danger. They are. Joshua insisted. Star knows it. That's why they came to our fence yesterday. Jack exchanged a look with Thomas, a silent acknowledgement of the unusual connection between the boy and the horses. You've still got that sanctuary on your property, don't you? Redwater, Jack asked. The one you built after Vietnam when you were training rescue horses. Thomas stiffened. That was a long time ago, but the facilities are still there. Jack pressed stables, paddocks, training rings. Margaret turned to Thomas in surprise. You never mentioned a sanctuary because it's not one anymore. Thomas replied gruffly. Just some old buildings falling apart, but you've got the land. Jack persisted. 50 acres, most of it fenced if I remember right. Thomas narrowed his eyes. How would you know that? Jack grinned. The Frontier Outlaws have been around these parts a long time. We know things. A new voice joined the conversation. Quite the gathering. You have here. Victor Harrington approached from the community center, his expression pleasant but his eyes calculating as they moved from face to face. Frank Miller hovered nervously at his shoulder, planning a protest. Perhaps Harrington continued, or something more direct. Jack straightened too, his full height, his leather jacket creaking, just having a conversation. Harrington's still legal in this country, of course. Harrington smiled thinly before turning to Margaret. I was hoping we might continue our discussion about your property, Mrs. Blackwood. My offer stands, but not indefinitely. I've told you repeatedly the ranch isn't for sale, Margaret replied firmly. Even if it means losing it to the bank anyway. Harrington counted at least my way. You'd walk away with something we're not walking away from. Our home, Joshua declared, stepping closer to his grandmother. Harrington's gaze settled on the boy, his expression softening in a way that seemed practiced rather than genuine. You must be Joshua. I've heard so much about your adventure with the wild horses. Quite remarkable. They're my friends, Joshua said simply, and they're scared of what you're going to do. A flicker of something. Amusement, discomfort crossed Harrington's face. Horses don't have emotions the way people do. Son, they don't feel fear or friendship. They're just animals. You're wrong, Joshua replied with absolute certainty. An awkward silence fell over the group. Thomas watched Harrington closely, noting how the businessman's confident demeanor had faltered slightly in the face of a child's unwavering conviction. Well, Harrington said finally, I can see you have strong feelings on the matter, but feelings don't change reality. The gather will proceed as scheduled, and my development will break ground. By spring, he turned to Margaret. Think about my offer, Mrs. Blackwood, for your grandson's sake, if nothing else. As Harrington and Miller walked away, Thomas caught a glimpse of something unexpected in the BLM agent's expression. Doubt, perhaps even guilt. There was a story there, one Thomas intended to uncover. I don't like him, Joshua declared once Harrington was out of earshot. Smart kid, Jack commented, flicking his cigarette butt away. Harrington's been buying up property all over the county. Word is he's got plans far beyond just a resort. What kind of plans? Margaret asked Jack. Shrugged. Mining interests. Water rights. The resort's just the beginning. He turned to Thomas. Your land borders. Red Rock Mesa on the north side, doesn't it direct access to where the Mustangs range? Thomas nodded reluctantly, seeing where Jack was heading with this. If we could redirect the herd to your property before the gather, Jack began. Absolutely not. Thomas interrupted. I've spent 20 years avoiding exactly this. Kinda mess. What mess? Joshua asked, looking between the adults. Thomas sighed, knowing he owed the boy some explanation after Vietnam. I set up a place for horses that needed help, trained them, rehabilitated them. It worked for a while, but then he trailed off. The memory still painful after all these years. Then what Joshua prompted there was an accident, Thomas said. Simply a bad one. I decided it was better if I kept to myself after that. Margaret's expression softened with understanding. The fire at Eagle Ridge, I remember now, that was your place. Thomas nodded, his jaw tight. Lost 3 horses, good ones, and a man almost died trying to save them. That wasn't your fault, Jack said quietly. Everyone in the valley knew that didn't matter. Was done putting others at risk. Thomas straightened up, and I'm not about to start again by interfering with a federal roundup. Joshua stepped closer to Thomas, his young face. Earnest, but Star trusts you. I saw it in his eyes. He remembers you helped him. Joshua. Margaret began, but the boy continued. The horses came to our fence to ask for help. He insisted they know something bad is coming. They're scared. Thomas looked down, at the boy, struck again by his unwavering certainty. There was something about Joshua's connection with the Mustangs that defied explanation, yet couldn't be dismissed. What if there was a legal way? Jack suggested a way to challenge the gather, at least temporarily. Like what Margaret asked. I might have an idea, Jack said, but it would require documentation of the herd's behavior. Evidence that these particular Mustangs exhibit unusual characteristics worth preserving. You mean like protecting a lost child? Thomas said, dry. Exactly. Jack's eyes gleamed with sudden purpose. What if we could prove these aren't just any wild horses? What if they're special, historically or culturally significant? The Spanish Mustangs. Margaret murmured, her expression thoughtful. There's always been talk that our wild herds descended from the horses brought by the conquistadors. DNA testing could prove it. Jack said if we could show these Mustangs have pure Spanish bloodline, it might be enough to trigger a conservation review. And how exactly would we get DNA samples from wild horses? Thomas asked skeptically. Joshua tugged at Thomas's sleeve. Star would let you. The adults exchanged glances, doubt mixed with desperate hope. It's worth a try, Margaret said finally. We've got nothing to lose. Thomas wasn't so sure about that. Getting involved meant risking the carefully constructed isolation that had protected him from further pain for 20 years. It meant facing the memories of the fire, the loss, the guilt that had driven him into seclusion. Yet as he looked at Joshua's hopeful face, at Margaret's determination to save her family's legacy, at Jack's unexpected alliance, Thomas felt something shift inside him. A door, long closed, creaking open. Just a fraction. I'm not making any promises, he said gruffly. But I'll think about it. For Joshua, that was enough. The boy smiled, a genuine expression of trust that hit Thomas like a physical blow. When was the last time someone had looked at him that way, with complete faith in his ability to make things right? As the group prepared to depart, the community center doors burst open, and Riley Carter, the local reporter, rushed out with her camera. Mr. Redwater, Mrs. Blackwood, can I get a statement about the Mustangs? Is it true you're planning to challenge the BLM gather? Thomas froze, unaccustomed to such direct attention before he could retreat. Joshua stepped forward. The horses protected me, the boy said clearly. Now we're going to protect them. Riley snapped a photo capturing Joshua's determined expression, with Thomas looming uncertainly in the background. The flash momentarily blinded them, but when Thomas's vision cleared, he saw Margaret looking at him with a mixture of hope and challenge. Well, she said quietly, I guess we're committed now. Indeed they were, for better or worse. Thomas Redwater, the hermit of Eagle Ridge, the man who had turned his back on the world, was about to find himself at the center of a battle that would determine not just the fate of a herd of wild mustangs, but the future of Wind River Valley itself. Dawn broke over Eagle Ridge, painting the weathered buildings of Thomas's property. In soft golden light, he stood on his porch, coffee mug in hand, surveying the overgrown paddocks and the dilapidated barn that had once housed his sanctuary. 20 years of neglect had taken their toll, yet the bones of the place remained solid, a testament to the care with which he had originally built it. The crunch of tires on the gravel drive announced visitors. Thomas wasn't surprised to see Margaret's old pickup truck approaching, with Joshua's excited face pressed against the passenger window. What did surprise him was the second vehicle, Jack Reeves, on his motorcycle, followed by 2 other members of the Frontier Outlaws, in a truck loaded with lumber and tools. "I hope you don't mind the cavalry," Margaret said as she stepped out of her truck. Jack offered to help get this place back in shape. Thomas raised an eyebrow at the biker. Did he now? Jack grinned, removing his gloves. "My daddy was a carpenter before he was a biker, taught me everything he knew." He gestured toward the barn. "That roof needs fixing before you can house anything under." "That I never agreed to house anything," Thomas reminded. The Joshua scrambled out of the truck, his eyes wide as he took in the property. "Is this where you helped the horses before?" Thomas nodded reluctantly. "A long time ago." "It's perfect," the boy declared. "Running toward the nearest paddock star will like it here." The adults exchanged glances. Joshua's certainty about the Mustang's thoughts and feelings remained disconcerting, yet none of them could quite dismiss it, especially after what they had witnessed. "Dr. Mitchell will be here this afternoon," Margaret said, changing the subject. "She's bringing the DNA kits and the paperwork for the conservation review request." Thomas set his coffee mug on the porch railing. "You've been busy. We don't have much time," Margaret reminded him. "The gather is in less than 3 weeks, and the bank's deadline isn't far behind, and you think saving a bunch of wild horses will somehow save your ranch." Margaret's expression hardened. "I think doing the right thing is its own reward." "Thomas, something you used to believe too, if I recall correctly." The rebuke stung. More than Thomas cared to admit, he turned his attention to the bikers who were already unloading supplies from their truck. "I didn't ask for a renovation crew." Jack shrugged. "Considerate payment for services rendered. Your war buddy Jim Reynolds was one of back in the day, said you saved his life in." Thomas stared at him in surprise. "Jim was Frontier Outlaws founding member," Jack confirmed, "before your paths crossed again during the fire." The SHS mention of the fire sent a chill through Thomas. Despite the warming day, Jim Reynolds had been the man nearly killed trying to save horses from the burning barn, the event that had driven Thomas into seclusion. "Jim died 5 years ago," Jack continued, his voice softening. "Cancer. But he never forgot what you did for him twice." Thomas turned away, uncomfortable with the direction of the conversation. "There's tools in the shed if they're still usable. Help yourselves," as the men set to work. Joshua approached Thomas, his young face earnest. "Can I see where Star will stay?" "No one said Star is staying here," Thomas reminded him, but found himself leading the boy toward the barn. Nonetheless, inside dust mows danced in the shafts of sunlight that penetrated the aging roof. 6 stalls lined one wall, their wooden doors still intact despite years of disuse. A tack room occupied one corner, and an open area in the center had once served as a training space. "It needs cleaning," Joshua observed matter-of-factly. "It needs a lot more than that," Thomas replied. Joshua walked to one of the stalls, running his small hand along the wooden door. "This one should be Star's. He likes to see everything." Thomas watched the boy curiously. "How do you know what he likes?" Joshua looked up, his expression completely serious, the same way you do, before Thomas could respond. Margaret appeared in the doorway. "Joshua, come help me unload the truck," as the boy ran out. She turned to Thomas. "How bad is it?" "Structurally sound. Except for part of the roof." "Nothing. That can't be fixed." He hesitated before adding, "If it needed to be." Margaret smiled knowingly. "You're already thinking about it, aren't you? Taking in Star, and maybe some of the others I miss, and thinking about how crazy this whole plan is." Thomas corrected. "Her, even if we get DNA samples, even if they prove these are Spanish Mustangs, there's no guarantee the BLM will delay the gather. But it gives us a chance." Margaret insisted, "a legal foothold." Thomas shook his head. "You're pinning a lot of hope on some very long odds. Hope's all I've got left." Margaret replied simply. Hope and Joshua outside. The sound of hammering echoed across the property as Jack and men began work on the barn roof. The familiar rhythm of construction brought back memories. Thomas had long suppressed of building this place after returning from Vietnam, broken in body and spirit, finding healing in the creation of something meant to help other damaged souls, both Eoin and human. "Why did you really stop?" Margaret asked, quietly after the fire. "It wasn't just about the horses that died or Jim's injuries, something else happened." Thomas moved toward the tack room, if only to put some distance between himself and Margaret's perceptive gaze. "Ancient history, not to you," she observed. "You're still carrying it." Thomas ran a hand along a dusty saddle rack, memories threatening to overwhelm him. "The fire wasn't an accident," he said finally. "It was set deliberately by someone who didn't want me rehabilitating those particular horses." Margaret's eyes widened. "Who would do such a thing? The horses came from a breeder who'd been mistreating them. Rich man, powerful connections. When I reported him, he lost his license. The fire was his revenge." Thomas turned to face her. "Sheriff Holden was a deputy back then. He knew who was responsible, but the evidence disappeared. Charges were never filed, and you think Holden was corrupt? That he took a bribe?" Thomas shrugged. "I think he was following orders from somewhere after that. Decided the safest thing for everyone was to close down and keep to myself." Margaret was silent for a moment, processing this revelation. "I'm sorry," she said finally. "That wasn't right. Few things are in my experience. And yet, here you are, getting pulled back into a fight for what's right." Margaret smiled slightly. Maybe it's time. Before Thomas could respond, they heard a vehicle approaching through the barn door. They could see Sarah Mitchell's veterinary truck pulling into the yard, followed by a patrol car. Sheriff Holden stepped out, his expression grim as he surveyed the activity. "That can't be good."